Hello, and welcome to the humor lecture for the Intro to the Creative Arts. My name is Kenneth Steinbach. I'm one of the instructors, and today we're going to be looking at the role of humor, how humor is used in the visual arts. Unlike theater and movies and things like that, humor in the visual arts tends to be, perhaps not as direct. Without the element of time, it's hard to tell, a straightforward joke. However, humor is used in a lot of different ways, and there are still a lot of applications or ways that it is engaged in the visual arts. One of those ways is, sometimes people are just making artworks because they like to make funny things, and I think that that's true also in the theater. It's, certainly true in movies and other fields, but just like that in the visual arts, sometimes we just celebrate the joy of making and the pleasure of fun ideas. Artworks can also use humor to engage serious ideas, as well as, and one of those might be, they're often a way to speak about difficult things or to confront those in power. And we'll see some examples of that kind of playing out ahead as we move forward in our talk today. Another broader area that we'll touch right at the end, and that is that sometimes humor is not necessarily sort of joke telling and not as direct as like that, but the idea of playfulness. It's hard to have a playful spirit about something without an element of humor or sense of humor about what you are doing. And so we're going to maybe pull back a little bit and kind of look at the 30,000 foot view of humor as it relates to this idea of playfulness and the way that that is an important part of our lives. And if we sort of omit that, if we become overly serious, we lose a lot. And in particular, it's a really essential part of creative practice. And creative practice is a word that gets used from time to time by artists, and really it's kind of a specialized term that really just means an artist goes into the studio, they make all of the stuff that they make as part of a process, as part of a larger experience, and that entire process is called creative practice. And so as part of creative practice, playfulness is a really essential part of that. Also, as we are going on here, once again, my dog Ernie, my little doxy Ernie, is with me in the studio as I'm recording this. And today he's not chewing on a water bottle like he was last time. He's chewing on a milk bottle, plastic milk bottle. He's way into this, so you're going to hear a little crinkling, and he drops it occasionally. So we'll just maybe attribute that to a different kind of humor as we are going today. So returning back to our first point, sometimes artworks are just playful and funny. And we're going to be looking at a half a dozen or so artworks here in which people are just celebrating the joy of making and the pleasure of fun ideas. Our first artist is an artist named William Wegman. And Wegman, back in the 80s and 90s, he was a photographer, and he began a series of photographs of his dog. The story, as I remember it, was that he was getting a little bored, couldn't figure out what to do, and his dog, he had two different dogs, but one of them was named Man Ray after a famous artist, surrealist artist back from the 1920s. So this Weimaraner named Man Ray was hanging out in the studio, and Wegman turned his camera to Man Ray, the dog, and just started putting him in these kind of strange and funny and ridiculous compositions, in these the ridiculous scenes, always being very kind to his dog. He's never cruel to the creature, but just using the dog to explore just some crazy kinds of visual scenes and visual puns and visual jokes that he has created and puts together. It also tends to dress up the dog quite a lot and just put him in generally awkward situations. And Man Ray seemed to be quite a good sport, and seemed to. I had heard an interview with Wegman one time where he said that Weimaraners are really focused dogs. They like working, and Man Ray the dog always seemed to kind of appreciate that he had a job in the studio, that he had things to do. Ernie is really giving this milk bottle a workout, so hopefully that's not too distracting. But another artwork by William Wegman. After a time, he acquired a second Weimaraner. Fay Ray it was a female, so he named it Fay Ray. And Fay Ray was an actress from the 20s and 30s. So not an artist, but an actor, not a visual artist, but an actor. And she is best known for being in the original King Kong. She was the the woman who was held in the paw of King Kong as he climbed the Empire State Building. Super relevant information. Glad I could share that with you today. But Man Ray and Fay Ray became his subjects as depicted here. And it is worth sort of poking around and doing some Google searching of William Wegman. I mean, they are just genuinely sort of laugh out loud funny artworks. Just tickling your funny bone, however you want to describe it. They're absurd and they're ridiculous. I don't know that sometimes we're looking at artworks and they sort of, they start larger conversations. They lead us into different ways of thinking and regarding the subject. I don't know that William Wegman's work, really is about that. I think it is just about, this kinship that we have with our fellow creatures, especially dogs, and just exploiting that and playing with that, for all it's worth. If we go back in time a little bit more, before the 80s, get back into the 60s or so, we start looking at a movement called pop art. And pop art was, had a number of practitioners. Andy Warhol, sort of the most famous of the group. But pop art was a bunch of artists that really kind of started in New York, and they were these artists whose source images and source ideas and the things that they depicted, came from ordinary life. So they had art school educations and all of that kind of stuff. But when it came time to paint things, they were not interested in painting sort of all those heavy duty art school, it's like figures and, abstract stuff that like the abstract expressionist movement was right before this. And so they were very interested in sort of lighter subject matter. They were interested in subject matter that was more what one would encounter in daily life, So Jasper Johns is painting flags, and Andy Warhol is painting soup cans, and Klaus Oldenburg, and earlier in his career he was making work by himself, but later on in his life he was working with his partner Kuzi van Bruggen, and the two of them started working on these monumental pieces, and of course this is the one from the Walker Sculpture Garden, the Cherry Spoon Bridge. And one of the ways that we can think about pop art is that it is not meant to be serious entirely. It doesn't have sort of the heft and the sense of self-importance, perhaps, that abstract expressionism does, or works from the Renaissance or whatnot. They were meant to be delightful. There was meant to be an element of humor, within this work, and it seemed to function best that way. And all the artists really seemed to pursue this. They intentionally kind of kept things moving, and they kept things a bit more lighthearted as they were working. Had to take a minute and get Ernie settled down. So now he's sitting in front of the space heater and not chewing on the water bottle. So I think it's a little quieter now. So we can continue. So another work by Klaus Oldenburg and Kuzi van Bruggen in Brussels. These pop art is not typically known for mystery complexity in that way. It's known for other ideas. So the self-explanatory dropped cone, this large ice cream cone sculpture that is, on top of this building in Cologne, Germany, quite typical of the work by these two artists. Other major pieces that they've done around American cities, they did a giant clothespin, it's probably 60 feet tall, in an eastern city. They have a handsaw that's sort of sawing through the landscape in another one. There's a giant pencil eraser, things like that, that are just meant to be sort of delightful and fun. And again, the goal of these was not merely whimsy. The goal was to be playful, but also to turn the camera lens toward other subject matter throughout art history. It has been sort of focused in in sort of high art subjects, you could say. It's like figures, people, history, places, religious iconography, stuff like that. And the pop artists were interested in just like, what about the rest of life? What about looking around my environment? What about the humor and the sort of playful pathos of a dropped ice cream cone, right? Have we all done that as kids? He dropped that thing, and it's like, oh, so depressing. And they just capture the humor and the wit of that. Another pop artist from this era would be Roy Lichtenstein. His has a clearly identifiable style because all of his work was taken directly from comic book pages or Sunday comics pages, where he would take a single panel and sort of alter it and change it, and then make paintings of that. So you're actually looking at a painting. The scale of his paintings are typically like 5 feet wide or so. So that would be the scale, and this would all have been hand painted. In our era of digital reproduction, computer-based imagery, and very ease of making things. It's good to remind ourselves that back in 1962, when he was making these, this would have all been sort of painstakingly hand done. The black outline around that taka taka, text that's there, that would have all been very carefully and painstakingly sort of painted. Um, Roy Lichtenstein, I've seen major retrospectives of his work, and this is just a consistent theme that he, continued all through what he has done, all through his career. A couple of pieces down at the Walker. He's got a big sculpture of a kind of a paintbrush piece down at the Walker Sculpture Garden. A couple other things that are noteworthy is the degree to which Roy Lichtenstein takes pains to capture the printed quality in his paintings. And so if you are printing a comic book, there are sort of like halftones and things that are made with tiny little dots called Ben-Day dots. You don't need to know. You don't need to know that, but these tiny little dots. And he actually in his painting would take great care to like reproduce those tiny little dots because he wanted it to so clearly resemble and echo and reference those. Sunday comics and the comic books that he had a connection to. If we go back another few decades, we find ourselves in the Surrealist era, and looking at a piece by perhaps the most well-known or the most prominent female surrealist, Merit Oppenheim. The work that we're looking at here, the surrealists, had other goals. The surrealists were very interested in this notion of the subconscious. This was about the era, or a little bit after the era, in which Freud had developed his idea of the subconscious. That art, like there are ideas and motivations and things that are part of our lives that lie below the surface that we're not consciously dealing with. And the surrealists were very interested in that, and they played with that idea, and they tried to sort of draw it out, or they tried to get us to engage this notion of the subconscious. And there's a little bit of that happening in this Merit Oppenheim piece, which is such a strange and funny artwork. You have this very elegant sort of English tea, saucer, teacup and saucer and spoon, which she has all lovingly covered with fur. And just this notion of, putting that thing into your mouth just immediately hits kind of the gag reflex. And so there's a very visceral reaction to this. But it's also an idea that, the surrealists, like to maybe consider, based on this notion of the subconscious, that underneath this sort of veneer of sophistication, we're all just, we are creatures underneath it all. And so there are layers, we have primal instincts underneath all of that. And so, this piece is often suggested to kind of evoke those notions. But at the very least, it's just a very funny piece that sort of captures, this instant reaction and creates an instant reaction for us, The other artists that we will be looking at through this section are actually less sort of pegged to specific points in art history, and they're more contemporary, and they perhaps are less responding to the historical eras. One of those is Sandy Skoglund, an artist who makes these very large photos. She made this piece probably in the early 80s, mid 1980s or so. And again, it's good to remind ourselves that this was done before digital photography. And so all of these goldfish that she has created, all of the scene that she's doing here, this is very much set work. All this stuff was what was called practical effects, not special effects. So it's like existed in real life, those are three-dimensional objects that she sort of hand sculpted and hand painted. So she would spend months sort of making these photo scenes, and then at the very end hire these actors to come in and sort of, or I'm not sure if they're actors or participants. She'd have these participants come in and engage this, and the wit and the humor of these pieces, showing the bed right there. We're not quite sure what's happening here. The playfulness of the scene evokes a mystery. Like, what's really happening? Is the person who's sitting there, is he an embodiment of the person who's sleeping, who gets up into this fantasy world? What is the connection? And it's the humor and the playfulness is meant to sort of take us to a fascinating place. The way that a good story, the way that a good novel, the way that a good book will sort of take us to a fantastical place where we can sort of revel in the pleasure of this playful experience, this funny experience where there's humor and wit that engages us. Particularly enjoy the way that the fish are sort of weaving in and out of that dresser right there. Wonder what kind of mischief they're getting into. Another work by, I believe, a Brazilian artist. Don't quote me on that. Gabriel Orozco, well-known artist from that part of the world. The car that he and his assistants altered. I was reading a little bit up about this, and they said that he and his assistant made this piece in 1 month, where basically they took a full-size car, cut it down, altered it, and turned it into this kind of fantastical object, which only has room for a single individual. He's almost like trapped in there like a spaceship or some kind of weird, sensory deprivation pod or something. It's a very odd little, and very funny. These are not meant to be, pieces that are heavy-handed in the kind of content, but at the same time, he is sort of engaging notions of, perhaps the way that driving can be isolating, or just like, the way that we can be sort of trapped in certain kinds of technology that we're really by ourselves. Or perhaps even just like, the way that as we're driving down the road, that sometimes it's really nice to be alone. I don't think that pieces are necessarily always negative at times. I think they are poetic, and like many poems, they can sort of spread out in multiple directions. It's like, I think we have all had that experience where driving down the road, you have music on, and, that's a really sort of wonderful, pleasurable experience. But, the strange object that this is, and so nicely crafted, brings us a certain, the humor is well employed here. I have three artworks by the artist Tom Friedman. And this will sort of take us from the section that we are talking right now, where humor for its own sake, into the next part of our talk. But to dwell on this one for a few moments, as I was refreshing my notes on this, I looked and I had found that it was actually for sale. So anybody wants to purchase it, I think it's out there in the internet, and you could pick this thing up. Tom Friedman is an artist who employs humor frequently. And he uses sort of visual puns, visual paradoxes, and strange, quirky things as a way of first of all, again, sort of establishing this idea of visual delight, but also I think that they are employed toward other means too, and we'll talk about some of that. The work that you're looking at right here, the pencil logs. Friedman, by the way, as you're looking at this piece, it's about the size of a human brain, maybe, or a human head. It's like that scale. And in this piece, there is a single pencil point, and there's a single pencil eraser, and those 2 points are connected. So this is essentially like a single line that sort of weaves all the way through this, that he has sort of cut and painstakingly glued together. I think the piece is funny because it's not terribly complicated. Actually, would not be terribly complicated to make either. Not going to be easy to make, but there's, the skill level here is actually, it's an entry-level skill level, you could say. But, just the complexity of this and the knot. I think we've all had that experience at the end of a crazy day doing something that it's been difficult, or perhaps you just got done with a test that you didn't do very well. And you kind of feel like your inside your brain just sort of feels like this, completely knotted and tied up, and maybe a little too tense. But there is humor and wit that is applied in this piece as well, just in the application of what he's doing. We're going to do a bit of a pivot now and start discussing artworks that uses humor to engage more serious ideas. So rather than just having visual delight like a Man Ray photograph of his dogs, these are pieces in which the humor is revealing or pointing us towards something. And again, we're continuing with the artist Tom Friedman, who created this sculpture, painting slash sculpture of this piece of 2x4. I'm guessing it's about 5 feet long or so. And I need to describe this piece a little bit, which is part of the humor, and that is that this is actually a piece of painted wood. So Tom Friedman took this piece of 2x4 and painted it so it precisely looks like how it was before it was painted. And so if you were to see it before it was painted, it looked exactly like this. You see it after it's painted, it looks exactly like this. And it's just it's a visual pun, it's a visual joke that is great. And the part about this that I love the most is that, you come up on, in the gallery and you perhaps, see this piece like, what the heck is this? Is this some kind of modernist, minimalist nonsense, like whatever. Sometimes people get frustrated with minimalism and like, what is this thing? And then you read the placard on the wall, read the didactic on the wall, and it's like, well, son of a gun, and just like reading that and realizing what he has done and how he has changed this thing, it completely shifts in your mind, how you look at this, and what the object is and what's actually going on. And I just think that that's such a funny experience, to go from an ordinary object, and then you just read a paragraph on the wall, and suddenly this ordinary object just is completely altered and changed and transformed. Like our notions of it, our understanding of it is completely and utterly changed. I think it's just quite delightful in the way that he plays with us in this way. Our next artist, who would have been a contemporary of Andy Warhol and the pop artists, Roy Lichtenstein and Oldenburg, that we were looking at a little bit later, but more or less contemporaries, is Dwayne Hansen. And Dwayne Hansen has Minnesota roots. He was born in this area, grew up in Minnesota. The object that you're looking at here right now is a pair of sculptures, and it is a piece called Tourist 2. There is a Tourist 1 you can look up if you want to, but Dwayne Hansen was an artist who explored this notion or this theme of hyperrealism or superrealism, which is like like sculptural works in which the thing that he is depicting, or in this case the individuals that he is depicting, look as close and as lifelike as absolutely possible. And so as you're experiencing this, like the legs on the guy have hair, they have eyebrows, the paint is there. They actually look a little bit less realistic in photos just because that's what photography does. But when you see them in real life, they're astonishingly realistic. Of course, we all have people in our lives that look like this, right? It's like aunts and uncles and relatives and friends and neighbors and people that we love dearly that look like this. And Dwayne Hansen in this series, and this is a way that he has worked through his entire life. In this, he is not sort of ridiculing these people. He's been very clear about this in all of his talks that I have heard him give about these pieces. Like, he is not sort of choosing people who are not classically attractive, just kind of ordinary looking folks. He's not choosing them as a way of mocking them or making fun of them. His intention here is actually to elevate them and say, why is it that only certain people are photographed in our society? Why is it that only certain types of people are, attractive in certain ways, are sort of held up as models, or, the covers of magazines and things like that, or even in art history, it's the beautiful people or the powerful people more perhaps, that are the ones that are always getting sculptures and paintings and things like that. And so it's a bit of a pop sensibility. He's wanting to look at the world in a new light and say, your aunt and uncle who went to Florida dressed like this, he loves them. He knows you love them, and he is sort of depicting them with great intentionality of respecting who they are. And he's respecting them so much that he is willing to depict them precisely as they actually are, because he thinks of, that there's value in that humanity. There's value in representing that humanity. But also, these are not without humor either, right? Because, like I gotta say, first of all, I don't think I ever had that shirt, but it's like those colors, the 1980s. That's what how people dress in the 1980s, and so there is a little humor here in the cameras and the bags and like all of this stuff. Of course, we've all sort of been there, and perhaps there is some lighthearted humor, or the humor that we have when we look back at ourselves in photographs from 15 years ago, 10 years ago. It's like, oh, I can't believe I was doing that at the time, or I can't believe that I was wearing that at the time. And there is certainly some of that present. Our next two artists are a pair of individuals that have been making work together their entire lives, Komar and Melamed. During the early 1990s, the Soviet Union, which was a superpower at the time, it collapsed. And before that time, artists were not allowed to emigrate out of the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union kind of collapsed, then they did. And so these two Russian artists came to the United States, and they began, sort of making art here. One of the things that they were really fascinated by when they got to the West was the West sort of fascination itself with statistics and numbers. Like we take a survey, and it's like, well, what do you think about what the president is doing? And so you take a survey, and then we say, oh, 62% of people think that this is what's going on. And they were just really fascinated by that, because that really was not the case, under communist, Soviet Union. And so part of, there's a quote here where one of them, Melamed says, truth is a number. And that's kind of what he's talking about. So they were very interested and fascinated by all these statistics. And this became the basis for a body of work that they did that I think is probably one of it's a genuinely funny idea that they explored. So if you go to the website that is listed on the previous page, or just do a Google search, Komar and Melamed, most favorite paintings, one of the things that you will see is actually this data right here. And so this is such a peculiar and funny way of making art, because what they did was that they took surveys. They said, well, how do we want to make paintings that are popular, so how do you do that? You survey and you find out what people want. And of course, this is all very tongue-in-cheek and very an early form of trolling, you could say. And so they had people take surveys. Excuse me. And they would say, what's your favorite color? All the questions that are listed on the survey here. What's your favorite color? What's your second favorite color? Do you prefer modern or traditional art? Do you prefer, what type of art do you like? And it's like all of these questions. And they also did this for a number of countries. And then they took this and they compiled all this data. And this was like a pretty big sample set. It's a pretty major survey. And it was done strictly according to like the way you do these kinds of surveys. And so if you go to the website and you click on any one of these little X's, the red X's, a little graph will pop up like you're seeing here in the bottom right with China. And you would say, well, in China, this is, let's see, when you select pictures, photographs, or other pieces of art for your home, what do you lean more towards? And this is all here. And so the data is here. So they collected all this data. They amassed all this data. And then, of course, what do you do with all of this stuff? Well, you compile all this stuff, and then you make a painting. And this is the kind of painting that they ended up making. And so this was the most favorite painting in the U.S. So basically, they took all of this data, like what's your favorite color? It's like, well, 60% of people said that blue was their favorite color, and 30% of people said green was their favorite color, and a few said red, and like what. And so they actually like statistically sort of ratioed that out into this painting. So 60% of the painting is blue, 30% is green, and whatnot. And then of course people like historical figures. So you got George Washington here. People like critters, so you got some animals, kind of like, I'm not sure if they're walking on that water or not, but they come up with these paintings that are just like so strange and completely weird. And what is this piece really about? It's like the paintings are sort of secondary, right? This is a way of talking about the absurdity of collective, trying to sort of make art collectively, or just, like the ridiculousness of that. And it's very funny. So I would encourage you, to go to that website because you can go through. You can also, by the way, see the least favorite paintings, which, by the way, are like tiny little abstract. People don't like abstract painting so much. So. But certainly they're using humor, and this humor is applied very directly towards looking at how we determine truth or how we determine value in a society. It's like, if all of us agree that something is true and beautiful, does that make it so? And these are the questions that they are asking. Another sculpture, public sculpture by an individual named Tony Tassett in Chicago. Large scale eye that we're looking at right here. Employs humor in different ways, but not wildly dissimilar to what Klaus Oldenburg and his partner were working on. Putting things into the public square that are meant to delight, but also sort of raise some questions or um, you know. Get us to think about certain things, and of course, with this gigantic eyeball sort of staring out at the world, like ideas about surveillance, perhaps, or observation, whether that's by a city-state or one person or another, or perhaps even, the eye of God, sort of looking down. It's like we don't know. He's not sort of naming that, but this notion of sort of eyeball and perception and observation, these things are absolutely sort of being engaged. Whenever I see this piece, at first glance, the first time I experienced it, I thought it was kind of cheap and easy. Didn't care for the piece, but the more that I've experienced it, kind of grows on me. It gets a little richer every time. One of the things that I've begun to think about this, and this is absolutely just Ken sort of referencing this thing. This is not anything that Tony Tassett said, but there's this writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote this pretty famous essay about perception, and it's called Circles. And I'll just read just a tiny bit of it here. And he writes, "The eye is the first circle. The horizon which it forms is the second, and throughout nature this primary figure is repeated without end. It is the highest emblem in the cipher of the world, or the question of the world. St. Augustine described the nature of God as a circle whose center was everywhere and its circumference nowhere. We are all of our lifetime reading this copious sense of this first of forms." So Emerson is saying, like, the eye is the beginning of everything. It's like even like the eye of God is sort of the beginning of our understanding of God. The God who sees, and that may be, again, just an insight into how I might think about this. It's certainly not anything that would be objective about this or something that Tony Tassett says, but this notion that this sculpture is just evoking all of these very powerful ideas, I think, is quite delightful and quite engaging. One of the things I had an opportunity to do several years ago was to write a book on creative practice or artistic practice, and as my research for that, I interviewed about 75 or 80 different visual artists who are like very noteworthy individuals. I spent a long time interviewing them and kind of figured out how they do what they do. That's going to be relevant later in our talk. But Hector Zamora was one of the artists that I had interviewed, and I really enjoyed my conversations with Hector. This particular performance that Hector did, I've always just found to be exceedingly funny because it's a time-based performance that was done as part of an installation. And Hector went into this museum. He created, had installed all of these scaffolds, and there are people sitting in there, and they're sort of typing away. There's like manual typewriters, and all of the people that are there are women. And so they are typing away, but the typewriters don't have any ink in them. And so he's given all of these women, sets of instructions. Please fill out this questionnaire. So they basically, and he, by the way, he paid them. So so they're all sort of sitting there. They're typing away, just so this clattering. And as you go into this space, you would like hear all of this typing from like 40 different typists. And then when they get done with the questionnaire, they take it out and they kind of flick it out into the open space. And so these pieces of paper are constantly kind of drifting down onto the floor. And if you were to see them, you would hold it up and all you see are some little indentations on the paper, and you're not actually seeing any writing. And so it's this notion of labor, this notion of anonymity, being anonymous in one's workspace. And Zamora, as he's talked about this one, really did peg it precisely to that. He said he wanted to make a piece that was about all of this anonymous labor, that women in particular in this part of the world, in his time and place, the women in particular were just like constantly sort of investing this labor that was never recognized, never rewarded, and it was largely in the pursuit or the advancement of other people's careers. And he just wanted to like point that out. And the piece on the one hand is absolutely very funny. I mean, it's, it's kind of this dystopian, strange Kafka-esque kind of understanding, or this experience of being here among all these, old typewriters. But at the same time, it is pointed towards an idea, which is, quite a powerful one. Another performance-based piece that Zamora did is we are seeing here. It's called Chimera, and this is actually Zamora in the photograph, which is documentation of the performance piece that he did. Chimera in his culture and that time and place is a word that means an unrealizable dream, or it's an illusion, something that we sort of fabricate by the mind. It's basically kind of a fantasy, unrealistic fantasy. So he had taken the word chimera and found all of these other words that kind of relate to it, the words that might conjure up chimera. Basically kind of opened up the thesaurus and sort of find parallel words to that, had those made into these balloons, which are quite common in that part of the world, and then this giant balloon bouquet, I guess you could say. Street vendors selling these kinds of balloons, not necessarily with these words, of course, but street vendors selling these balloons would be quite common in that part of the world. And so he walked around, his community walked around that, his environment with all of these words, related to chimera, like dream and fantasy, a bit of a party atmosphere, you could say, as he is kind of talking about the phenomenon of migration. And again, this is, he is from Central South America, he's coming from that part of the world, and his perception or his notion of looking towards America, and especially the American dream, and all of those promises that kind of, are sort of conjured by that. And so this is a piece that's kind of reflecting on that fantasy, which he sees as not a particularly healthy one. It's a fantasy that doesn't really it does not represent reality. Another installation view of Chimera, and again, this is Hector down below. This is in a gallery. It looks to be a little bit more fuller expression of this, perhaps with more words. But again, all of these words, related to this notion of fantasy or idealism or something like that. He's sort of in this space looking up at them. And there is, what's really lovely here is the distance, the physical distance between him and all of these words up above. And they're even, it's like even more out of reach. This notion of something being out of reach is even more present with this particular installation. Another individual that I had an opportunity to interview for my book was Henrique Oliveira, and who was a Brazilian artist. This is one of his pieces. He has, over the course of his career, kind of had a body of work in which he goes into museum spaces, specifically museum spaces, and sort of transform them with these large wooden structures that look like they are kind of taking over the space. They're, you have this crazy Jack and the Beanstalk kind of thing, sprouting up through the floor, crashing through the ceiling. This is what he, his body of work over the last number of years that he's been working as a professional artist, making these pieces that interrupt the spaces, that they interrupt, these pristine gallery environments. And in talking with him, I asked him, it's like, well, how do you get this source imagery? Where does your source imagery come? And he said a really funny thing, which was, I have this giant book of like diseases, that basically all these illustrations of tumors and things like that he kind of uses as source material. He doesn't quote it exactly, but it's like he gets inspiration from this really kind of gnarly book on it's like human maladies. Another large work by Henrique Oliveira, who is perhaps like one of the nicest people I ever interviewed in my whole life. He's just the kindest man. But he, in this series, he's very interested in this notion of the gallery. If you are in the visual arts section, we have kind of talked about what galleries are. Galleries are curious conventions in the Western world, and that is we create this space that has a different set of rules than everywhere else. If you put something in a gallery, and you just everybody understands. You look at it differently. We're meant to look at things in galleries, no matter what it is, no matter how it affects us. Like however it shows up, whatever it is. We just look at it differently. We look at it as an artwork. It's one of those social conventions, and he plays with that, and he likes to introduce, a bit of the natural world back into this. The previous one with this crazy plant-like structure just, crashing through this pristine spaces, and he's all about kind of transforming these spaces, back into something a bit more natural. Perhaps nature is coming back, nature is reclaiming. Other things are going on where the space is being interrupted. And in talking about this, Oliveira said to me that, these artworks are partly about, him as an outsider. He's Brazilian, he's South America. It's a different location. He speaks a different language than most of the U.S. and he always really felt like an outsider, in these spaces. And him sort of coming in and showing, he felt like he was some kind of something that didn't belong, or something that was a little bit too organic, or he didn't maybe he didn't fit neatly into the gallery space. And so these tended to be a little bit of allegories for his own experiences moving into these gallery spaces. Another contemporary artist who's making work that is just like ridiculously funny, and actually Erwin Wurm has done a number of these fat cars. They may have a different title, but they're all sort of known just generally as fat cars. There's probably a dozen different variations on this one. It's well worth the time just to poke around online and see these things, because they're just bananas in the way that they, this opulence, this excessiveness, or this growth, or this, certain kind of obesity of these cars, which are these inanimate objects, and yet he makes them so fleshy and human. I absolutely want to put a Roscoe's car and Erwin Wurm's cars next to each other. So you have the super skinny and the super fat, just this language of mechanized mobilization. At the same time, Erwin Wurm is, the car is kind of a surrogate. It's a way of talking about things in a larger culture. Perhaps excess and opulence and overconsumption, you could say. All of these things are present, and these are all just sort of wonderfully crafted objects too. The ridiculousness of these are just super delightful. So the humor here, again, sort of pointing us towards other ideas. Were he to just come out and start, making serious works, we may be easier to dismiss. But he employs the humor. He likes the humor. He employs the humor towards these statements and these ideas that are rich and very complicated and wonderful. Another individual I had the opportunity to interview, in thinking about that, I seem to interview all these people whose work has a lot of humor in it. Maybe that's telling about me, I guess, as well. But Beauvais Lyons, who teaches down at the University of Tennessee, and his point of reference for a lot of the prints that he is making are actually, botanical prints, from the 19th century, 18th century, where people were just trying to figure out how is this world sort of put together? What's the difference between one creature and another? Taxonomic systems, systems of organization, for how creatures and plants and animals all relate to each other were just beginning to be developed. And so in that time, in that place, these kinds of lithographs that look astonishingly like this, trees and plants and animals and creatures and fish and coral and whatnot, they were being created, and Beauvais Lyons is absolutely participating in that language. These are just like dead ringers in terms of stylistic methods, the materials that he's using, the way that he's rendering them, the positioning on the paper, all of that stuff. And of course, these creatures are completely fictional. The top left one, if you haven't, sort of perceived that as being a dogfish, maybe you ought to stop the talk and go walk around the block a little bit and come back when you're a little sharper, because it's totally, just kind of riffing on this and making very funny statements about, the strangeness of nature, I think. He didn't really sort of claim that, but when I look at, Beauvais Lyons stuff, one of the things that always strikes me is, It's like these creatures may not exist now, but holy smokes, the stuff that they find in the fossil records, stuff equally as nutty as this and crazy as this is probably out there somewhere. And I think he's doing it just for the humor of it, but I also think he's playing around with, how we look at science and how we sort of regard it and how we know things. It's like. Playing around with those kinds of scripts or playing around with those kinds of ideas that are floating in our larger culture. I just one of the installations that he has done. I believe this is in the like the library at the University of Tennessee down where he teaches. It's a large installation, and you're just seeing a photo of it. So there's very little explanation. If you're familiar with the movie Spinal Tap, for example, or any of the mockumentaries, this is a little bit of that feel where he's presenting something imaginary or unreal as if it was real, and literally never letting the mask slip, never letting us know that this is not, that this is an illusion. But of course, it's a fake fossil record of a centaur, and very nicely done. And he presents it as though this was an archaeological find, sort of still sort of embedded in the soil, which is how those things are often delivered to museums and so on. And almost, I look at this thing and it's like, yeah, I'm almost willing to kind of believe that could happen. So, and again, Beauvais Lines is perhaps just using the humor of this to allow us to reflect on science. Oops, I got cut off a little bit on that last slide, but maybe just a little bit of like the strangeness of the world and the wonderful strangeness of the world. So another area, perhaps that we could, the humor is used in the visual art, is that it's often a way to speak about difficult things or a way to confront power. Nothing dethrones, the emperor, the despot, the tyrant, like humor. And this is employed in a lot of ways by different artists, and we're going to look at a few moving forward. First artist that we're looking at here, she is maybe not necessarily taking on the grand, evil empires of the world, but Christy Blizzard did a series of pieces where she, back in the, a while ago, 6, 8, 10 years ago, it used to be that you could stand behind the people on Good Morning America, the GMA, and also the Today Show. They had windows behind them, and you could stand in the street behind them and just sort of hang out and look in like, you were looking at creatures in the zoo, right? And so she would make these signs. She did this whole series of performance pieces where she would make these signs and she would stand there. And these signs were never, confrontational. They weren't obscene. They weren't like provocative in a conventional way. But they were just these little non sequiturs, these little, cones, these little haiku like phrases that were just meant to like stop people and make them think in a different way. If you think about like how those, shows like the Today and Good Morning America, they're just so slick and they're so packaged and they just move from one idea to the next, and they're selling stuff, and the hosts are so good looking and they're so smooth and all of that. It's a real, once you get on the train, you just know where you're going. And she's just wanting to like kind of interrupt some of that. And so that is her on the top left, just holding up a sign that says the animal life. And, I don't know that these are, they don't reference anything. It's not like she's, theanimallife.com or something. She's just like offering these phrases as a way to interrupt what's happening, on the screen. This very slick presentation on the screen. The center one down there, what makes one free? That's when you sit down and watch this show in the morning with a cup of coffee, you're just trying to wake up a little bit, and then you have this person who is putting these riddles in front of you. I just love that. I am not a ghost up on the top right, and without you, I have no mirror. Some of them, like this one, without you, I have no mirror. Without, some of these did tend to perhaps reflect on the nature of broadcast television a little bit more. In this particular one is the phrase related to the camera. Without the camera, I have no mirror. Without, these celebrity, hosts, I have no mirror. What's going on. But they don't sort of resolve neatly into simple answers. They're just meant to sort of interrupt, ways of thinking that are very much not what Good Morning America and the Today Show are about. They're all just about like quick answers, quick question, quick answers. everything disappears, down at the bottom right. Again, I think these are great. I also interviewed her. She was fantastic. So much fun. And eventually they sort of invited her not to come back anymore. It wasn't the kind of thing where, she was, being so provocative that they had a legal case, but they just were kind of strongly suggesting that she go away. And she did a number of these. You can go onto her website, and there's, probably another 15 or 20 of them. But eventually, the piece kind of just ran its course. We are going to jump back a little bit now in time to um, a point which is about 1915, 17, 1918 or so. Um, and that is important to what we are looking at, this work by Marcel Duchamp, who is a part of the Dada movement. It's just spelled D-A-D-A, which is basically just kind of a nonsense word. Marcel Duchamp and many of the other Dada artists were, generally French in Paris, at that time. And if you know much about world history of what's happening 1915, 16, 17, 18, it is the First World War. And the First World War is a war of great mechanization. It's the first mechanical war, where there were no longer horses, there were tanks. There were no longer single-shot pistols, there were machine guns. No longer swords, there were machine guns. And it was a huge transition. And Duchamp and his fellow artists at that time, were witnesses to this. Some of them literally saw, trench warfare, and some of them kind of, experienced the culture around it and were aware of it by other things that were happening. And their reaction to this, their response to like the insanity of the First World War, which, by the way, was the First World War was very strange because there were all of these treaties that all these countries signed, and so when two countries went to war, suddenly they immediately had this huge world war. It just spiraled quickly. There were all of these boosters. There were a lot of people that were very pro-war before the war, which included, by the way, a lot of the clergy, a lot of the church at that time was very pro-war. It's like we'd have to go defeat, the evil, whatever on the other side of the trenches. And so Duchamp and the other Dada artists, saw this, and they just basically had kind of a wholesale rejection to the entire society that had produced this situation. Everybody, just rooting for war, and the war was just, all of this technology, all of the sort of the peak of the Industrial Revolution had delivered, mechanized warfare. And in the old James Dean movie, Rebel Without a Cause, there's a famous line where, somebody's asking the main character, James Dean, the rebel, he says, "What are you rebelling against?" And James Dean says, "Well, what do you got?" It's kind of like that. They're just rebelling against anything because they see the world in such a jammed up state that's really not productive. And so then they start making pieces like this, which is, meant to sort of plumb the depths of absurdity, which is this is a reproduction of, it's a postcard of the Mona Lisa that Duchamp has painted a mustache on. And the phrase down below, LHOQQ, LHOOQ, when you say those words out loud in French, it's like a pornographic poem. So the whole thing is meant to sort of be provocative and just like a finger in the eye to the art establishment. And they were actually quite serious about calling out the world. It's like it was an intentional act that was meant to be a public display. It was meant to sort of raise these questions, about value and progress and all of these things that they were calling into question. The work that you're looking at here, earlier I was speaking about galleries. A thing that happens in a gallery is you can put anything in a gallery and people call it art. Like that's just, a convention that we have collectively agreed on in our society. Well, Duchamp took this piece one time. This is actually a very notorious piece. It's called The Fountain, and it's a urinal. It's maybe old-fashioned style, but it's a urinal. And so Duchamp, for an art show, Dada art show, had actually taken this urinal and put it in a gallery along with this, fake signature on it, and he called it art. And of course, it made everybody very angry, and it's still making everybody very angry. and again, I'm not sitting here as an authority in art saying you really need to like this piece or really need to accept it, because I think actually Duchamp would probably have loved the fact that it's still making people angry. The fact that he did this thing that was so objectionable. There was an objection. Part of the things that he was dealing with was, he was wanting to make things that were a response to an objectionable world, a difficult world. But one of the things that he did then was like in this gesture, like taking this object and putting it into a gallery that he actually almost did nothing to it, was he sort of waved a magic wand and he created this way of making art, which is called the ready-made. And the ready-made is just simply an object that exists that you just take from outside the gallery and you put it on a pedestal inside the gallery, and that's it. Like, then you're done. So he was very instrumental in doing this, and one of the first people, or perhaps the first person to ever do it, and he did it in such a big public way with this specific piece, that it became kind of this, like, forevermore. Whenever anybody says the word ready-made, you know exactly what they're talking about. It's a history and it's a lineage that goes back to literally this artwork right here. And again, my role here in sort of talking about these pieces is not to convince you that ready-made should or should not, exist, or you should have a relationship, like you should like these pieces or not. I think that's to maybe assume that that's what's going on, is to misunderstand. Like when we teach art, is like, what are we doing? So like really what we're doing here is we're talking about ideas that exist in the art world, and we can start to create a relationship to those. Sometimes we like those ideas and sometimes we don't. It's like, I'm not saying you have to, I'm just saying that these are the ideas that are present. Actually, I find most of these ideas really funny and engaging, and I like thinking about them, and I like the way that my mind works after I think about them for a while. What is curious about the ready-made and Duchamp and this era right here, the piece on the left, which is the sculpture by Sir Alfred Gilbert, this memorial that he had made for his brother. This was made about 1880. The fountain on the right was made about 35 years later. And so just think, in terms of art history, like the conceptual jump between these two sculptures, like holy smokes, like that is a massive change in the way that people are thinking about art, the way that the people are thinking about representation of what is value and what is not, and who decides what is important and what is good art and what is not. And there's just such a huge pivot. And the Dada artists were really a part of that. They were very influential in kind of reshaping the nature of that reassessment or the reorientation of those kinds of criteria. A contemporary Chinese artist whose work also uses humor towards political ends or political goals is Ai Weiwei. And Ai Weiwei is probably in his mid-60s by now. China over the past 30 years, 40 years perhaps, has gone through a massive sort of cultural shift from being largely agrarian, largely rural, quite poor, to being really this technological superpower. It's probably the biggest national superpower on Earth right now in many ways. And one of the things that Ai Weiwei is often has done in his artwork is to reflect on the cost of that. And so what you're looking at here is actually a Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty was an early Chinese dynasty. I think it's about 1,500 years old, or years ago that dynasty flourished. And this is literally an urn, kind of a vase from that era. And Ai Weiwei took this and painted the Coca-Cola logo on the side of it, really as a gesture to kind of echo what he has seen happen in the larger, Chinese culture, and that is, we're discarding history. We're just like this, eventually just kind of trashing our history in order to sort of update and rush toward a new modernized China. Another artwork that Ai Weiwei created in 2009 is much less whimsical than our previous one, but it also deals with some events within China. What you're looking at here is a large sculpture made out of children's backpacks. There's about 9,000 backpacks that are here, and the Chinese phrase that is being spelled out here or written out here is this. It says, "She lived happily for 7 years on this world." And this is an artwork that references a specific event in China in the Sichuan province in 2008, just a year before he had made this piece, there was a very large earthquake, and the earthquake killed a lot of people, like 80,000 people. And unfortunately, a very high number of those were children. And one of the reasons that Ai Weiwei believed, and this is largely been proven, a lot of the reason that so many children were killed is because they were in school at the time, and the schools were built with substandard materials. Like people were bribed to look the other way, to build those schools more poorly than they should have been. And so, really, he's saying as a result of this corruption, all these children were killed. And so the piece here, does this use humor? It's, sort of, but holy smokes! I mean, it's a humor that is really barbed and pointed directly and with extreme confrontation at leaders, who would have been in charge at this time. And it's certainly not anything we're going to laugh about, but there is a jokiness to this. Like the colors are bright, there's a lot of playfulness about this until we understand what is going on here. And he sort of twists the knife, you could say, with that playfulness. Even in the phrase, "she lived happily for 7 years in this world," was actually a quote from one of the victim's mothers who had said that. So, and it was... not shortly after this, but not too long after this, that Ai Weiwei was, he was imprisoned in China. His studio was bulldozed, and then after a while they let him out and they kicked him out of the country. So he has been in permanent exile ever since. He is not welcome back in China after this. Our final way that we are considering the use of humor, or how humor plays out in creative practice, artistic work, is related to the notion of playfulness. And playfulness may be distinct from humor; they're not the same. However, it's hard to have a truly playful spirit without, an embrace, or like a big embrace of humor. And we find that not only is this humor, a part of creative practice, but it's really part of our human experience, and we discard that, at great loss to ourselves and great loss, as artists as well. So there are two artists who when I think about, playfulness and artist who really is just looking to play, actually quite akin to the way that children play left by their own, just like finding an idea and just going with it and like churning out artwork and delightful experiences for other people to do, but are maybe not necessarily as jokey as the first body of images that I was showing you. The first would be Yayoi Kusama, and one of the pieces, one of the series of artworks that she has created over her career are these infinity rooms. And the infinity rooms are rooms that are maybe like 10 by 12 feet or so, which have mirrors literally on every surface on the inside. So you go into the room, you close the door, and then as you look in every direction around you, this is what it looks like, but it's all an illusion, of course. And I just think that these are really sort of gorgeous and funny. And of course, she is, she kind of loves these other bright sculptural forms, so she puts these in, and so these crazy little sculptures that she makes fit inside these things that just expand infinitely, out into the edge of our perception forever. And they're just, delightful and playful and goofy and fun. And, humor is maybe not the first thing we think about, but absolutely they are delightful, because they are so playful. Another infinity room here that you can see, and also this is the artist herself on the bottom right. Kusama is an individual. She is actually almost precisely the same age or born in the same year as Andy Warhol, within a year or two of Andy Warhol. Warhol has passed, many years ago now, but Kusama, she is still going, I believe, and quite old at this point. But she only really received some recognition later in her life. There were a few things that were standing in her way, of achieving what she has, because certainly the work that she was doing, if you look at Warhol and what he was doing and how he was doing it, if you look at Kusama and what she was doing, not just the infinity rooms, but a lot of other things. The question is raised is like, how did Warhol get so massively famous and she did not? Well, first of all, all, she's Japanese, and so at the art world there at that time there was much stronger bias, like people were, they kind of felt like New York was the center of the art world. Also, she was a woman, and also she was pretty open about the fact that, she had some mental health issues that kind of affected her, her ability to sort of get along in the world, and as a result, she had maybe, I don't know if things overcome is a way to kind of phrase some of that, but there were things that made it, the social pressures that sort of hindered her achieving some of that, acclaim that Warhol did. So anyway, Kusama, if you ever get a chance to check out the Infinity Rooms, I think you should. Our final artist that we'll be looking at today is Jennifer Bartlett, and I just have two slides by Jennifer Bartlett, who is a contemporary artist, probably in her, making artwork in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and probably even still today, but it really came to prominence in the 80s. And when I think of, sort of a person who is principally like, using the studio as a place to play, just really deeply invested in the physical things that she is making, less interested in making large grand statements. She's not about social change like Ai Weiwei. She's not responding to, despairing situations like the Dada artists. They're not just principally funny, but they are just about a lighthearted way of looking at the world. Like, how do we sort of analyze the world? How do we perceive the world and think about the world? Jennifer Bartlett basically just starts with, in all of her installations, she starts with this notion of a subject. In the case of the one that you're looking at right here, is the notion of a house, and asks herself the question, like, how many possible ways can I think about sort of recreating or rendering or thinking about the idea of a house? And so she works with this motif. It's about a 1 foot square, tile that gets on the wall, and she's making these individual. And you can see that this is an installation. I mean, these installations just go and go and go. They fill up, entire museum, 3 or 4 giant spaces in the galleries. And you can kind of hone in, and like on the left there, you're seeing like these super abstracted, almost like childlike renderings of houses on the wall. And then over on the right, it's getting more pixelated. The space in the back is starting to look like architectural drawings. This little solo image that I showed on the bottom left there, that's, a very highly crafted kind of impressionistic image. But she's basically just saying more and more and more, like, let's just collect all of this stuff and depict all of the ways that a human mind can possibly think about, the way that a house can be considered or thought about in our culture. And she's creating these. Another one of her installations, I don't know if, I think that this one is still part of the house installation, and so you can see that it just like takes off for miles. And there, over on the right, you see like, a series of maybe, 75 tiles or so, or making like one giant house. And over on the left, we're seeing like individual houses that are being rendered. But again, this installation is like sprawling and massive and big, and it really is about the spirit of play. It's like, why does Jennifer Bartlett do this? Why does a person tell a joke? A person tells a joke or uses humor for a lot of, it's fun. We like to do this. It's a way to kind of, make other people happy. It's a way to sort of, it builds relationships. It is, there's a lot of social things that kind of happen with that. It's a way that we explore ideas, and it's a way that we sort of say things that, sometimes are hard to say with a straight face, and I just love the way that, within that spirit, like, why does Jennifer Bartlett make her work? Because it's fun to make this kind of work, because it creates a bond between us as people. It's fun to sort of get people to look at what you are doing in a way that it sort of expands their thinking. And it's also just a gift, a way to offer other people an enjoyable experience, in what they are doing, in the afternoon, like as they are in the gallery spaces. So, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you. Happy to be able to talk about these things. Don't forget to take the quiz, and we'll see you again.